The avoidant will never love the way emotional availability courses through secure attachment, will never express care through the vulnerable declarations and consistent presence that most people recognize as love's language. Waiting for the avoidant to demonstrate love through traditional markers, verbal affirmations of feeling, sustained emotional intimacy, comfortable vulnerability, eager pursuit of closeness, means waiting for expression that contradicts everything in the avoidant's defensive structure. The avoidant's nervous system interprets the very behaviors that signal love in secure people as dangerous exposure requiring immediate defensive withdrawal. Yet the avoidant does experience love, does feel attachment that matters profoundly to them, does care in ways that penetrate their defended position, even as that position prevents them from expressing care through recognizable channels. The tragedy of avoidant love lies not in its absence, but in its invisibility to people who expect love to look like secure attachment's natural expressions. The avoidant demonstrates love through language so subtle, so contradictory to what secure love looks like, so easily missed or dismissed by partners expecting traditional emotional availability, that their deepest expressions of care often go completely unrecognized. The avoidant who returns after withdrawal loves you. The avoidant who tolerates discomfort to remain present loves you. The avoidant who reveals fragments of authentic self beneath their defenses loves you. Yet these demonstrations require translation, require understanding that for someone whose entire psychological structure organized around preventing vulnerability, every small step toward you represents internal battle. Every moment of sustained presence costs tremendous psychological effort. Every glimpse beyond their walls signals trust that contradicts their defended instincts. Understanding how avoidants demonstrate love does not require accepting insufficient intimacy or tolerating emotional unavailability. It requires recognizing that love filtered through avoidant attachment looks radically different from secure love. That the avoidant's expressions of care operate in entirely different register than what emotionally available people naturally provide. That what appears as minimal effort or insufficient investment may represent the absolute maximum the avoidant's current capacity allows. Number 1. They show up consistently in small practical ways. The avoidant cannot offer the emotional declarations, vulnerable conversations, or sustained intimate presence that secure partners provide effortlessly. Their defensive structure prevents them from expressing love through direct emotional language or comfortable closeness. Yet the avoidant who loves you demonstrates that love through reliable appearance in practical, tangible ways that require no emotional exposure. They remember that your car needs maintenance and mention it without prompting. They notice when you are running low on something you use regularly and quietly replace it. They show up to help you move furniture, fix something broken, handle a task you have been dreading. These actions lack romantic drama, carry no vulnerable emotional weight, require no expression of feeling. Yet for the avoidant, these practical demonstrations represent love expressed through the only channel their defenses permit. The significance of these practical demonstrations lies in their consistency rather than their grand gesture quality. The avoidant does not love through occasional dramatic displays that would require emotional vulnerability they cannot sustain. They love through reliable small actions repeated across time, through showing up in ways that demonstrate they track your needs even when they cannot verbally acknowledge caring about those needs. The avoidant who brings you coffee made exactly how you like it without asking, who clears snow from your car before you leave for work, who picks up the specific item you mentioned needing weeks ago, demonstrates love through attention and follow-through that contradicts their emotional unavailability. These practical demonstrations also represent the avoidant's attempt to contribute to your well-being through methods that feel safe to their defended psychology. The avoidant cannot say, "I love you and want to make your life easier," because that verbal vulnerability triggers their defensive withdrawal. Yet they can demonstrate the same sentiment through action. "I noticed this would help you, and I did it." The action communicates care without requiring the emotional exposure that words demand. For the avoidant, doing holds far less terror than saying. Completing practical tasks feels infinitely safer than expressing vulnerable feelings. The consistency of these practical demonstrations signals genuine investment despite emotional limitation. The avoidant who sporadically helps when convenient demonstrates minimal care. The avoidant who reliably appears for practical support, who consistently notices and addresses your practical needs, who sustains pattern of helpful action across months and years, demonstrates love within their capacity. This reliability in practical domain compensates partly for their unreliability in emotional domain. The avoidant is telling you through repeated action, I cannot give you emotional availability, but I can give you this consistent practical presence. Partners often dismiss these practical demonstrations as insufficient because they lack the emotional intimacy that love typically requires. Yet for the avoidant, these actions represent genuine stretching beyond their defended comfort zone. The avoidant's natural impulse is complete independence, maintaining distance that prevents anyone from depending on them or them depending on anyone. When the avoidant consistently shows up practically for you, they are overriding this defended impulse. They are choosing to be depended upon in limited ways, accepting responsibility for contributing to your well-being, allowing themselves to matter to your daily functioning. This represents vulnerability within their capacity, even though it lacks the emotional vulnerability secure people easily provide. The avoidant also demonstrates love through practical consistency precisely because practical action feels less binding than emotional intimacy. The avoidant who helps you with concrete tasks can maintain belief that they remain autonomous, that practical assistance does not create the entanglement they fear, that doing things for you differs fundamentally from being emotionally vulnerable with you. This distinction allows the avoidant to demonstrate care they genuinely feel while protecting themselves from the terror that emotional intimacy generates. The practical demonstrations become compromise between their desire to express love and their need to maintain defended distance. Understanding this practical language of avoidant love requires recognizing that actions speak when words cannot, that reliability in small things signals care when emotional presence remains impossible, that the avoidant who consistently shows up practically is telling you through the only language their defenses permit that you matter to them. The question becomes whether practical consistency without emotional availability meets your needs, not whether the practical demonstrations represent genuine care. They do represent care. They simply represent care expressed through dramatically limited channels that may or may not provide sufficient foundation for relationship that satisfies emotionally available partners. Number 2, they share space with you even when uncomfortable. The avoidance defensive structure generates strong impulses towards solitude whenever emotional intensity increases, whenever vulnerability surfaces, whenever intimacy deepens beyond their comfort threshold. The avoidance nervous system registers these moments as danger, triggering automatic defensive response to create distance that reduces perceived threat. The avoidant who loves you fights this impulse, choosing to remain present even when every defended instinct screams for withdrawal. This choice to stay, despite discomfort, represents profound expression of love that partners rarely recognize because it lacks visible struggle, because the avoidant's internal battle remains hidden beneath surface appearance of reluctant presence. The avoidant who sits with you during difficult conversation when their impulse demands escape demonstrates love through remaining despite activation. The avoidant who stays physically present during emotional moment when they want to flee the intensity shows care by overriding their defensive programming. The avoidant who tolerates closeness that feels threatening to their defended autonomy reveals attachment strong enough to temporarily override self-protective withdrawal. These moments of chosen presence despite discomfort represent the avoidant's highest expression of vulnerable love. Yet partners experience them as reluctant tolerance rather than as profound demonstrations of care. The significance lies not in the avoidant appearing comfortable during these moments of shared space, but in their choosing to remain despite visible discomfort. The avoidant cannot metabolize emotional intensity with the ease that secure partners demonstrate. They cannot sit through vulnerable conversations without their nervous system activating. They cannot tolerate sustained closeness without feeling encroached upon. Yet the avoidant who loves you endures the discomfort, manages the activation, tolerates the encroachment, because losing you feels worse than enduring the temporary distress that presence requires. This tolerance of discomfort represents invisible sacrifice partners never fully recognize. The secure person who stays present during difficult conversation does so comfortably, without internal war between impulse to flee and desire to remain. The avoidant who stays present fights moment-by-moment battle between defensive impulse demanding withdrawal and attachment desire requiring presence. Every minute the avoidant remains costs psychological effort secure people never expend. The avoidant is choosing you repeatedly across the span of single conversation, across the duration of uncomfortable intimacy, across the period of closeness that activates their defenses. The avoidant also demonstrates love by sharing space during activities that require no emotional vulnerability, but still activate their defended need for autonomy. The avoidant who regularly spends time with you, despite their strong preference for solitude, shows care by sacrificing alone time they desperately need for relational presence. They find draining. The avoidant who participates in social activities with you when they want to be isolated demonstrates investment by overriding their instinct toward independent functioning. These moments lack obvious sacrifice because the activities appear normal and shared time seems like basic relationship requirement. Yet for the avoidant, each instance represents choice between defended comfort and relational participation. Partners often interpret the avoidant's visible discomfort during shared space as rejection or insufficient care. The avoidant appears restless, seems eager to leave, displays signs of wanting to be elsewhere. These signals read as lack of desire to be present, as evidence that the avoidant would prefer solitude to partnership. Yet these same signals actually demonstrate the cost the avoidant pays to remain present. The visible discomfort proves that staying contradicts their defended impulses, that they are overriding natural inclinations because you matter more than their comfort. The avoidant who could leave but chooses to stay despite obvious discomfort is demonstrating profound love through means partners consistently misinterpret. The avoidant's willingness to share space even when uncomfortable also signals trust that contradicts their defended position. The avoidant's defensive structure developed partly to prevent others from witnessing their authentic responses, to maintain control over what they reveal, to avoid exposure of their internal state. When the avoidant remains present despite discomfort, they risk you witnessing their activated state, observing their struggle, recognizing their defensive responses. This visibility contradicts the avoidant's typical pattern of withdrawing before their defenses become apparent. The avoidant who stays while uncomfortable trusts you enough to let you see them in defended state rather than maintaining perfect controlled presentation. Understanding this dimension of avoidant love requires interpreting their continued presence as the communication rather than their visible discomfort. The discomfort is real and valid. It reflects genuine activation of their defensive nervous system. Yet their choice to remain present despite that discomfort communicates that you matter enough to override their defended programming, that losing connection with you feels more threatening than tolerating the discomfort that presence creates. The avoidant cannot make themselves comfortable with intimacy through willpower. They can choose to remain present despite discomfort, and that choice represents their deepest available expression of care, even as it appears as reluctant tolerance to partners expecting enthusiastic engagement. Number 3, they let you see beyond their defenses, even briefly. The avoidant organizes their entire relational life around preventing others from seeing their authentic internal experience, maintaining carefully controlled presentation that reveals nothing vulnerable, keeping their defended walls intact at all costs. This defensive structure is not performance or manipulation, but rather deeply ingrained protection mechanism that operates automatically to prevent the overwhelming vulnerability their early wounds taught them to fear. The avoidant who loves you demonstrates that love through rare moments when their defenses lower enough to allow genuine glimpses of their internal world, when they risk showing you something real beneath their protected exterior, when they choose brief vulnerability despite the terror that choice generates. These moments arrive without announcement or preparation, appearing during unexpected instances when the avoidant's defensive structure temporarily relaxes. The avoidant shares a genuine fear they have never articulated to anyone. They reveal a childhood wound that explains their defensive patterns. They express authentic feeling about you or the relationship without the emotional distance that typically characterizes their communications. They allow tears to surface when they would normally suppress all emotional display. These glimpses beyond their defenses last briefly, often followed by immediate defensive withdrawal as the avoidance nervous system registers the exposure and demands protective distance. Yet these moments represent the avoidant's deepest expression of trust and love, demonstrating that you have penetrated their defended position enough to merit access to their authentic self. The significance of these brief glimpses lies in their rarity rather than their duration or frequency. The secure person offers consistent emotional transparency, shares their internal world readily, maintains ongoing vulnerable communication. The avoidant cannot sustain this level of exposure without overwhelming their defensive capacity. When the avoidant shows you something genuine, they are offering the maximum vulnerability their system can tolerate. These brief moments represent equivalent of secure person's sustained intimacy, compressed into instants that cost the avoidant tremendous psychological effort. The avoidant is telling you through these glimpses, I trust you enough to show you who I am beneath my defenses, even though this exposure terrifies me and I cannot sustain it for long. Partners often respond to these rare, vulnerable moments by attempting to extend them, by asking follow-up questions that push for more disclosure, by expressing relief or enthusiasm that suggests they want more of this vulnerable sharing. These responses, while natural, often trigger immediate defensive shutdown because they communicate to the avoidant that their vulnerability has created expectation for more than they can provide. The avoidant shared a glimpse and received message that the glimpse was insufficient, that more is expected, that their maximum offering falls short of what you need. This dynamic ensures that vulnerable moments decrease rather than increase over time, as the avoidant learns that showing themselves generates pressure for more exposure than their defensive capacity allows. The avoidant demonstrates love not just through offering these glimpses, but through choosing you as the person who receives them. The avoidant maintains defended distance with everyone, reveals nothing genuine to most people, keeps all relationships at surface level that requires no authentic sharing. When the avoidant shows you something real, they are differentiating you from everyone else in their defended life. They are communicating that you matter enough to risk the vulnerability they categorically refuse with others, that you have earned trust that contradicts their defensive structure's fundamental mission. The avoidant is not showing you everything, is not offering sustained vulnerability, but is showing you more than they show anyone else, and this differential access represents their expression of special significance you hold. These moments of glimpsing beyond defenses also reveal the person the avoidant might be without their defended structure, offering preview of the emotional capacity buried beneath their protective walls. The avoidant who briefly expresses genuine feeling, who momentarily drops their emotional distance, who temporarily allows authentic connection, demonstrates that capacity for intimacy exists within them, even though their defenses prevent consistent access to that capacity. These glimpses show that the avoidant's emotional limitation is not absence of feeling, but rather inability to sustain access to feelings that exist beneath defended layers. Partners witness in these moments what the relationship could be if the avoidant could maintain this level of presence, yet these glimpses typically serve to highlight what is usually absent, rather than providing foundation for sustained intimacy. The avoidant's inevitable withdrawal following these vulnerable moments also communicates information about their love's limitations. The avoidant cannot remain in the vulnerable space they briefly accessed. Their defensive structure requires retreat to restore the protection that vulnerability threatened. This pattern of glimpse followed by withdrawal reveals that the avoidant's love, while genuine, operates within narrow bandwidth of sustainable vulnerability. The avoidant can show you moments of authentic self, but cannot maintain that authenticity across time. They can offer glimpses, but cannot provide sustained emotional presence. This limitation defines what relationship with the avoidant can realistically provide regardless of how much they care. Understanding these brief moments as the avoidant's deepest expression of love requires recognizing that what appears as insufficient emotional sharing actually represents maximum vulnerability within their current capacity. The question becomes whether rare glimpses of genuine connection satisfy your needs for intimate partnership, whether moments of authentic presence compensate for extended periods of defended distance, whether occasional access to the avoidant's true self provides sufficient foundation for a relationship that meets secure person's needs for sustained emotional intimacy. The glimpses are real. They demonstrate genuine trust and care. They simply may not occur frequently enough or last long enough to create the emotional connection that sustains satisfying intimate relationship. Number 4, they choose you repeatedly despite their impulse to withdraw. The avoidance defensive structure generates persistent impulse toward permanent withdrawal, toward ending relationships before intimacy deepens enough to threaten their protected position, toward choosing defended isolation over the vulnerability that sustained connection requires. Every moment of closeness, every instance of depending on you or being depended upon, every experience of genuine care activates this impulse. The avoidance nervous system interprets increasing attachment as increasing danger, flooding them with urgent need to create distance before they become so attached that losing you could devastate them. The avoidant who loves you fights this impulse not once, but continuously, choosing to return after each withdrawal, deciding repeatedly to maintain connection despite every defended instinct demanding permanent escape. This pattern of withdrawal, followed by return, represents the avoidant's most profound demonstration of love. Yet partners experience it as the relationship's most painful dimension. The avoidant creates distance that feels like abandonment, disappears into defended isolation that generates anxiety and hurt, then returns as if the withdrawal required no explanation. Partners focus on the pain of withdrawal, on the anxiety of not knowing whether return will occur, on the exhaustion of repeated cycles of distance and reconnection. Yet each return actually demonstrates that the avoidant's attachment to you exceeds their attachment to their defended position, that losing connection with you feels worse than tolerating the vulnerability that connection creates, that they are choosing you over the safety that permanent withdrawal would provide. The significance lies in recognizing that the avoidant's return is not automatic, not guaranteed, not the obvious choice their withdrawal return pattern makes it appear. Each time the avoidant withdraws, they experience relief as their defensive structure restores protection that intimacy threatened. They feel the comfort of defended independence, the safety of emotional distance, the peace of not having to manage attachment anxiety. From this defended position, the avoidant faces genuine choice: remain in comfortable isolation or risk returning to relationship that will inevitably activate their defenses again. The avoidant who returns is choosing discomfort, vulnerability, and attachment anxiety over defended peace. They are selecting you over their safety, deciding that connection with you matters more than protection from intimacy's terror. Partners rarely recognize this choice as expression of profound love, because the withdrawal itself causes such damage that the return feels like restoration to baseline rather than like active choice toward vulnerability. Yet the avoidance return represents overriding of their defensive programming, conscious decision to move toward what their entire psychological structure insists is dangerous, deliberate selection of you despite every defended impulse, suggesting that permanent distance would feel better. The avoidant is demonstrating through repeated returns that you matter enough to override their most fundamental self-protective instincts, that losing you feels more threatening than the vulnerability that maintaining connection requires. The avoidance pattern of choosing you repeatedly also signals that their attachment to you has deepened despite their defensive efforts to prevent that deepening. The avoidant who can permanently withdraw has not developed attachment strong enough to override their defenses. The avoidant who keeps returning despite wanting to stay away has formed attachment that contradicts their defensive structure, that persists beneath their protected walls, that demands they maintain connection even when every defended instinct insists they should end it. The return pattern reveals that you matter to the avoidant in ways that penetrate their defended position, that their care for you has grown beyond what their defensive structure can comfortably manage. This repeated choosing also demonstrates that the avoidant recognizes at some level that permanent withdrawal would constitute loss they cannot accept. The avoidant's defensive structure typically prevents them from recognizing the value of what they have until after they have destroyed it. The avoidant who returns is showing unusual capacity to recognize your value before completely losing you, to understand that their impulse to withdraw stems from fear rather than from genuine desire to end connection, to override their defensive programming because they have developed sufficient awareness to recognize that following their impulse would create regret they cannot tolerate. This awareness and the choice it generates represents psychological progress within the avoidance defended limitations. Partners must decide whether the avoidance pattern of repeated choosing despite withdrawal impulse provides sufficient foundation for sustainable relationship. The avoidant is demonstrating love through returning, through choosing you repeatedly, through overriding their defensive impulses to maintain connection. Yet this demonstration occurs within dynamic that generates chronic anxiety, that creates repeated cycles of abandonment and reconnection, that demands tolerance for withdrawal patterns that secure attachment would never produce. The avoidance repeated choosing is real expression of care. The question becomes whether that expression, delivered through pattern of withdrawal and return, meets your needs for consistent presence and emotional stability. The avoidant who returns also often returns without explanation, without acknowledgement of the withdrawal, without apparent recognition of the pain their pattern creates. This lack of processing frustrates partners who need the avoidant to understand the impact of their behavior. Yet the avoidant's inability to discuss or explain their withdrawal pattern does not negate the significance of their return. The avoidant cannot yet articulate their internal process, cannot explain the battle between attachment and defense that their nervous system wages, cannot put words to the terror that drives withdrawal or the attachment that drives return. They can only demonstrate through action. I left because my defenses demanded it, and I returned because you matter more than my defended comfort. This demonstration, through action rather than explanation, represents the limit of current avoidant capacity, showing love through choice while lacking ability to verbally acknowledge or explain that choice. Understanding the avoidant's repeated choosing as expression of love requires shifting focus from the pain of withdrawal to the significance of return, from the anxiety of not knowing whether they will come back to recognizing that each return demonstrates love that overrides defended impulses. This shift does not require accepting treatment that harms you, does not obligate staying in relationship that generates chronic distress, does not mean tolerating patterns that contradict your needs. It simply means recognizing that the avoidant who keeps choosing you, despite their impulse to withdraw, is demonstrating the deepest love their current defensive capacity permits, even as that demonstration occurs within framework that may be insufficient for your relational well-being.